issues. Although Stephen Ratner once recently said that that's more a symptom than a cause, and I tend to agree with that. That this is all ultimately demand driven, and that the supply chains ultimately just are strained because they're trying to meet demand. But again, that's just my own view, and I certainly am no Lawrence Summers, who is really the guy I like to follow on this stuff.
All right, cool. Well, why don't we switch gears? Well, no, you did mention also Marx and some of your criticisms of him. Did you wanna talk about some of the work that you've been doing lately on that?
Well, I wrote a two-part essay in December and then early January about why his values theory is wrong. And I guess really the thing that just, I mean, there's just so much with Marx that I find very problematic. But the most fundamental thing is, and this is really what Capital Volume 1 is all about, which is this notion of surplus value. And I get this sense that a lot of people think, I mean, I should say that I actually don't particularly like the words capitalism and socialism. I put them in quotes. One, because they just carry so much baggage that I think they've become somewhat meaningless in the discourse. They just mean a lot of different things for different people. And anyway, for me, economics isn't really about mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, if you will. I mean, a lot of people talk about it in terms of capitalism, quote unquote, but I ultimately think it's not a very helpful way of understanding things. Economics is simply about resource allocation and understanding how markets allocate resources, how people respond to prices and costs and things like that. So that's one, that's a kind of a preface or a precursor. And the reason it's important is because Marxian economics ultimately comes down to defining what he understands as capitalism. And what he understands as capitalism is capital accumulation, that it's a whole system built to accumulate capital on the backs of workers, in particular, unpaid labor. And this is really the crux. I mean, at least in my view, this is where Marx either stands or falls, and in my view, falls, is that surplus value, the discussion around capitalism and profit is usually about profit and whether profit is good. And of course, profit is good because it reflects value creation. But the thing is, Marxian economics tends to see surplus value as bad because of this. I'll get into this. But people basically think that the criticism coming from Marx is that capitalism is bad because it generates profit, and that profit is inherently exploitative. But at least in Marx, there's a difference between the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit. But more fundamentally, profit arises ultimately from surplus value. And surplus value is simply the following idea, that you have a working day, and then you have what you call socially necessary labor time. And socially necessary labor time is just basically the average amount of productivity across all workers. So, he observes that people are different productivity, they're either motivated or they're not, and so on. And so you wash through all that by coming up with this average idea, this average amount of or quality of labor that's necessary to generate means of subsistence, commodities. And so if you just take an example, a shirt or loaves of bread, a certain batch of loaves of bread, and just say that socially necessary labor time to generate a batch of loaves of bread is 6 hours. In capitalism, the idea is that you hire the free wage laborer, and free in quotes because the idea is that he's actually not free, and you pay him for 6 hours and you work him for 12 hours, and the 6 extra hours is surplus value. So basically, you have paid labor and unpaid labor. And then you have, so that's absolute surplus value, it's 12 minus 6. And then you get relative surplus value where, suppose the law says you can only work people for 10 hours a day. So relative surplus value is that you're using technological development to reduce the amount of socially necessary labor time. So now, you can have technological improvements that, so it takes only 5 hours or 4 hours or 3 hours to generate, this subsistence, socially necessary labor time. And so as you increase the intensity of labor, or you increase technological or improve technology You can reduce socially necessary labor time and therefore increase the relative surplus value, that is socially necessary labor time relative to the total working day. Anyway, this is complete nonsense. If you
Yeah.
know anything about basic economics, the wage in a competitive market is equal to the marginal revenue product. In other words, a worker is paid exactly for what he produces. And if you think about the upward sloping nature of a supply curve, each point along that supply curve represents a reservation wage. It's basically a point of indifference between labor and leisure. It's like, if I'm going to work, I have to earn at least this much. Okay. And then you compare, and so that's true for every marginal worker along the supply curve. And then you've got the demand curve. This is in the labor market, by the way. And you have the labor demand and labor supply, and they intersect, you get a market clearing wage. And the wage up to the point of equilibrium is above each point of the supply curve, which gives you producer surplus, in this case, the worker surplus. So you can, in some sense, say that the worker is exploiting the firm because he's getting the market wage when he's only willing to work for his reservation wage. But anyway, I can go on and on. That's just basic lesson in economics. There's 2 points. One, worker earns the wage is equal to marginal revenue product. And along the inframarginal, the rest of the supply curve, you're earning your reservation wage, or the market wage, which is above your reservation wage. So you're earning what you produce and some. And this is just basic economics. And the idea that this whole global centuries-long system of capitalism, which is based and capital accumulation, is based on this nefarious division between paid and unpaid labor, is just complete, utter nonsense.
And I mean, even more fundamentally, if you look at subjective value theory, which, I mean, Marx and the subjectivists were, I guess, we're writing around the same time, but there's a reason that subjective value theory kind of came out on top. It makes more sense. And if value is indeed subjective, then the idea of surplus of something subjective is kind of absurd on its face.
Well, there's the other side of this. So I was talking about the production market, or the supply side here.
Sure.
Actually the labor market. But what you're saying is, I mean, is that's taking it, the analysis to I don't know if you say one step further, or you completing the narrative. But I mean, yes, for Marx, everything's organized around production. Value is created in production. But that's wrong too. That's another fundamentally wrong precept in Marx. David Harvey would say that value is produced in production and realized in exchange. But that's just wrong. So what you need is a demand curve, and that's where subjective value theory comes in. That is, you have preferences. People either want to buy or they don't. And so you have the upward sloping supply curve. Well, I mean, you can have flat or inelastic supply curves, but the standard, you have the upward sloping supply curve, and then you have the downward sloping demand curve. And that's just saying that, people are willing to buy whatever it is at different prices. And so you compare that to the market clearing price, and you have consumer surplus introduced into producer surplus. But anyway, the point is, yes, value is subjective. And if you can write a whole lot of bad novels, right? And nobody wants to buy them. Yeah. But Marx would say, well, in a sense, what Marx is saying is that's value, because, you've put all this labor into writing a bad novel. It's value, I mean, I'm just using that as an example, but, and again, you got to go back to socially necessary labor time, because that's really the idea. But yes, I mean, I'm basically agreeing with you that value is not fundamentally located in production per se. Mm-hmm. It's also located in preferences, in subjective value. You can create all the blueberry pies that you want, but some people want cherry pies. And so that creates substitution. Like, substitution is just fundamental to economics. Substituting between products based on price change and preferences and that sort of thing. So basically, yes, I agree with you.
Yep. Substitution between products, substitution also between immediacy and waiting. I mean, time preference is a huge deal here.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, if I somehow were to construct a tractor, it would take me years. If you and I constructed a tractor, maybe our skill sets are a little bit different. It would take us less time. But if we had an entire assembly line of tractor builders, well, yes, we're going to have to pay them, but there's also payoff for us, and that is not fundamentally unjust.
No, it's not. And like the division of labor is one of the main developments that Marx seems to associate with the rise of quote unquote capitalism.
Mm.
And I'm not sure that he necessarily says that's a bad thing, but that there's something, but that there's all sorts of these bad things that arise out of it. And his all of his chapters on primitive accumulation and so on, that basically people are thrown off the lands, enclosure and all that, and states start to protect private property and all that. And I mean, this is all just basic natural. I mean, he makes it out to be this sort of centuries-long sort of capitalist conspiracy to take over the state, take over the means of production and all that, and just with absolutely no humanitarian regard for all the people thrown, quote unquote, thrown off the land, and his families just slaved away in the factories and so on. When in reality, that's just and this is explored in books by like Douglas North in The Rise of the Western World, and many other books on economic history. Joel Moker has written about culture and ideas, and David Landis has written a book on the wealth and poverty of nations. I might watch that. But anyway, the issue is that the basic argument of North and Wolf, or is it Thomas, his co-author, is that 10th, 11th, 12th century, you have population growth. Eventually, land becomes scarce. People move around; they go to other places. Land is more abundant, but ultimately, you just have more and more population growth. Cities arise. More markets arise. So there's greater needs. There's more complex societies, and so people need to divide up tasks and basically have a division of labor, and you have specialization in different regions, because different regions can produce things more efficiently. So, comparative advantage. And anyway, yada, 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 the whole history about just basically the increasing complex connections of regional economies that are mediated through markets. And I mean, it's not like history is just one great peaceful affair. There's obviously all sorts of frictions that happen here and there. And one of Douglas North's biggest concerns is with, the path dependencies of institutional development and the way they address or don't address things like transaction costs that either facilitate or do not facilitate market transactions. But anyway, you can explore all this in great detail. The basic point is, again, I'm agreeing with you. Division of labor is a great thing, and Adam Smith was right.
Yeah, and just before we change the subject, I'll quickly plug Thaddeus Russell's course that's coming up. He and Ben Burgess, who is a philosopher in the Marxian tradition, notably not an economist, they're going to be doing a 8-part series on Marx's Capital. Thad as a former Marxist, Burgess as a current and unabashed Marxist.
Oh yeah.
So that'll be it'll be super interesting to join. If anybody in the audience wants to check it out, I will probably be attending as well. Why don't we switch gears then to Stoicism? Before we start, why don't we just lay a very basic ground level of what is Stoicism, in your words?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think about whether it's better to go historically or through the philosophy. I guess a little bit of both. I mean, so it was founded by a guy named Zeno of Citium. He was a merchant, fourth century BC, I think. The story is he was he was sailing on the Mediterranean, a ship filled with purple dye from Phoenicia, and this was, very valuable stuff. It was extracted from shellfish or something. It was used to dye the robes of emperor's robes, and presumably all sorts of other linen and apparel and whatever. But anyway, it was a fortune on the ship, and he lost in a shipwreck, landed in Piraeus, went over to Athens. I mean, some people say he was a penniless immigrant. Some, I think, sources say he actually had pre-existing investments, but whatever the case. He walked into a bookstore one day and he heard the bookseller is reading from Xenophanes, I think. I botch the Greek names all the time, but he was reading from a book basically about Socrates, Socratic dialogues, and he just loved what he was hearing. And he said, he kind of stood up, said, "Where can I find a man like that?" And the bookseller, there was a Cynic philosopher named Crates that was walking by. He said, "Follow him," and he did. Came under the tutelage of Crates for a few years, but eventually branched off and created Stoicism. Basic idea of Stoicism, really, a lot of people talk about it as the dichotomy of control, but more fundamentally, it's about virtue. And the idea that living a happy or eudaimonistic, flourishing life is all about living a life of virtue, building your character. It's 4 cardinal virtues, which come out of Plato, which is wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. And if you can learn to build your life around virtue, you can learn to build a life of flourishing, of eudaimonia. And the way that you do that is that you exercise your capacity for reason, which has been endowed to you by nature, learning how to live in harmony with the world around us, nature, understanding your role in nature, your role in society, how you relate to other people, how you relate to yourself. And all of this is what leads to the dichotomy of control, which is, focusing on the things that you yourself control, your will, your choices, and so on, and not on so-called externals. And this is where it kind of gets tricky, and you have to navigate each situation and figure out what actually is under your control, because it's not a philosophy of resignation. It's not simply saying, just give up on the things you can't control, but it's really more about using your reason to recognize where it is you can have the most impact based on your own abilities and your situation. That's where you get into the interconnectedness of the virtues. So wisdom being exercised to recognize when it's right time to be courageous, and recognize why it's better to be moderate rather than excessive. Recognizing instant opportunities to contribute to justice, and being courageous in the pursuit of justice, and so on. So it really is very much about reason and about agency, and all in the pursuit of virtue, and being in harmony with nature.
I'm reminded of the Serenity Prayer, hearing you talk about that. Do you,
Yep.
is that kind of a Christianized version, or I guess more theicized version of
Basically.
Stoicism?
Yeah, it's I mean, I guess I would call him my Stoic friend, my very good friend, but I was wondering whether I should call him colleague, but he was very helpful in helping to draft the book and looking over drafts and so on. But his pet peeve is to think about Stoicism as simply the dichotomy of control, because that's essentially the Serenity Prayer, and that you really have to come back to virtue to understand what the dichotomy of control means for the Stoic. But yes, I mean, the Serenity Prayer is a basic way to understand the dichotomy of control.
Cool. Can you explain the dichotomy of control a little bit more, with a little bit more elaboration? It kind of flew over my head, maybe.
Yeah. So Stoics are distinguished from the Cynics,
Okay.
in a very, very fundamental way, in that the Cynics are a much more what was the word I was austere version of they concentrate on a more austere life. In other words, the only thing that matters is virtue, like nothing else matters. The Stoics moderate that a little bit and say that you can have these, I mean, everything is everything that's not virtue, we ultimately should be indifferent about, but you have preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference. So you can, it's obviously nice to have wealth and health and those sorts of things.
Mhm.
But the thing is, you can misuse them. That's why they're not as fundamental as virtue. But anyway, I'm getting to your question. Don't worry. Let's just say that you have, really good health, and you're also very athletic and a good athlete. And so you're about to enter into competition. I don't know, basketball player or something, and you play the game. You want to win, but you don't really ultimately have full control over whether your team is going to win. All you have control over is to play as well as you can, to prepare for the game as well as you can, to train, to study the game, and then basically to play as well as you can. But you can't control necessarily how the other players are going to play, whether the refereeing is bad, whether there's the ball takes a bad bounce or just goes in and out of the rim or whatever. So essentially, that's the idea: is that you want to focus on what it is you can control, and take some wisdom to figure out what it is that you can control. And there's just things that are outside of your control. The importance to why it's important is because, if you're playing a game that comes down to the wire and the referee makes a bad call, I mean, yeah, we all get upset about it, but ultimately it wasn't your fault. There's no reason that you need to get all out of sorts. Come back to a more serious example, the brain tumor that I was I was pretty stoic when I found. I was just like, congratulations to the doctor, because she figured out what was the reason I went to the hospital a few months before that. I don't have any control over the fact that there was some mutation that arose in the cell. So there's just nothing I can do about that. There's no reason to get upset about it. Mortality is coming to all of us. It's in the nature of living that we're all going to die. Obviously, rather live longer than shorter. It's a preferred indifferent. But I don't have control. What I do have control over is going to see the doctor, going through surgery as I did, listening to the doctor's advice, doing the chemo and the radiation, which actually wasn't that bad because my tumor is still very low grade. And to the extent that it was, I mean, it just is what it is, and you deal with it. So that's the idea, is you just got to figure out what it is that you can control, what you can't control, and not getting all worked up about what you can't control.
You mentioned earlier that it started out, you were calling it your toxic masculinity, which I'm guessing is kind of poking fun at people who actually believe in toxic masculinity. How would you differentiate, if you would, between toxic masculinity and Stoicism, other than that Stoicism is illegitimate?
Yeah, I think that the basic idea is that there's a distinction between lowercase Stoicism and uppercase Stoicism, and I think that the guidelines, the American Psychological Association guidelines, they were ultimately talking about lowercase Stoicism, which is the layman conception of emotional repression and being cold-hearted and all that, and not about philosophy of Stoicism. And my argument, I guess I wasn't as clear about that, but essentially, by failing to make an explicit distinction between the two, you're in some sense reinforcing the conflation of the two, because a lot of people who are not familiar with Stoicism and then come across a book like, A Stoic Approach to Social Justice, which is what my next book is about, will just immediately think about Stoicism in terms of toxic masculinity, the Marlboro man, emotionally repressed person who's not dealing with his emotions in a healthy way. And so I guess that's the guidelines talk about it in terms of like aggression, competitiveness, and all sorts of things, and then that feed into these traditional masculinity narratives. But particularly in the context of Stoicism, it would have to do with how you deal with emotions or not dealing with them, so to speak.
Yeah, that so I'm firmly in the camp that says that, you know, emotions generally speaking are caused by intellectual thought. It might be an underlying belief that you don't consciously think of. It might be something that, you know, you consciously think and then that leads you to become angry or happy or whatever it is. But that, you know, emotions can be conquered through reason. Is
Yeah.
that in line with Stoicism?
Yeah, I mean, at least as I understand it, there really isn't a distinction between reason and emotion in Stoicism. They're wrapped up in the same sort of capacity of the individual to um, assent or not assent to particular judgments. So emotions it's kind of a problem of translation in a sense, because emotions are more about value judgments, and you got to distinguish that from feelings or like immediate impressions.
Oh, sure.
So
Okay.
so there's um, I guess I botched the Greek pronunciation, but there's the word fantasia, I think it is. That's sort of the notion of these immediate impressions on the senses. And then the issue is like how you process that. And the idea with cultivating reason is cultivating the ability to develop appropriate judgments about what those impressions mean, or how you should deal with them. One of the ways that I think about that often is in terms of like to bring it back to social justice stuff is insult passivism. You know, when you talk about microaggressions or oversensitivity,
Mm.
political correctness, and the idea that you're trying to regulate the discourse to be sensitive to people's, psychological makeup or whatever. And I think as a Stoic, you certainly want to be sensitive to other people. That taking into account the impact of your actions is certainly in line with justice. But at the same time, what's fundamental to Stoicism, to me at least, more fundamental, is intent. And sometimes people are not, Stoic sage is rare as a phoenix, and none of us is perfect, so we make mistakes. And so when it comes to things like microaggressions, which ultimately, I mean, uh, people will say it's not subjective, these are real things, but I mean, the way it's defined is itself somewhat incoherent because, some subcomponents like micro insult, and then they give examples that are like really bad insults, and you're like, how is this micro? It's an actual insult. So, but anyway, I'm getting on a tangent about the conceptual incoherence of it. But the issue is that Epictetus, Stoic philosopher, would say, stand by a rock and start insulting it. Think about it. What have you really accomplished? Now obviously human being is not a rock, so they receive and process it, but it is the case that we're sort of objects like the rock, and it's really the insults are just verbal vibrations vibrating off us, and it's really up to our own reason to say that, this person's trying to get me all riled up. Why should I let that happen? It doesn't reflect I'm the person who is the determinant who determines my self-worth, not some troll on Twitter who's trying to get me all worked up, or somebody who says something controversial in the public discourse. I mean, if you let all of that get to you, you're really psychologically fragile. This is what Haidt and Lukianoff call fragility activism and coddling up the American mind. And so that's just the idea, is that, first of all, you want to distinguish between the impressions that come after us and the emotion as a value judgment. If somebody close to you really dies, it's appropriate to feel grief. That's that immediate sensation. That's in alignment with nature. But if you're still grieving 2 years afterwards and you just can't live your life, then you're obviously not coming to terms with nature, because you're not coming to terms with the natural fact that all of us die and mortality is part of life. And so it's a mistaken judgment. That emotion of grief 2 years after the fact is a mistake in judgment. It's a value judgment that's mistaken. And that's the basic idea. And it's all wrapped up in one, because it's the capacity to form those judgments, to perfect your reason, to cultivate your reason. If you're still in grief 2 years after the fact, that's just reason that has not been cultivated or is not working properly.
Do you think that there are tools that people who are temperamentally more inclined towards hyper emotionalism, oversensitivity, that sort of thing, that they can use in order to be more rational, for want of a better term?
Well, I think that's where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in, which really kind of comes from Stoicism. Albert Ellis, I think, was one of the founders of CBT. Was well read in Stoicism, was influenced by Stoicism. I should emphasize, I myself am not a psychologist, and I wouldn't want to presume to, or a therapist, I wouldn't want to presume to know how to, or to offer therapeutic advice to, a variety of different individuals with their own sort of issues and contingencies and contexts and so on. In general, my own personal view is that there is something to be said for quote unquote growing up. But that's a general principle, and needs to, be acclimated to particular situations. And I think that in general, Stoicism is a way of sort of illuminating the power of reason to form good value judgments that allow you to put things into perspective, and to a perspective that alleviates the anxiety or pain or the suffering that you would otherwise associate with a particular sensation.
What do you think is the problem with, well, there might be a lot, but the main problems with white fragility theory?
The main ones, I mean, there's many, but I guess the one that everybody sort of understands intuitively is the way it functions as a Kafka trap. And I always, I read it so many times, I just forget how to even say it, but she defines it as a minimal amount of racial stress that's becomes intolerable. Let me look it up. I always forget, because I mean, basically, well, forget it. I don't even have to. I always memorize and then I forget it, because the basic idea is simple. Robin DiAngelo walks into a room and says, we're going to talk about whiteness, and we're going to talk about what it means to be white and why being white contributes to racism and racial inequality and so on. This is what she would call racial stress. Immediately is felt by the people in the room. So immediately they get all worked up, it becomes intolerable. So I've already used 3 words in her definition. And it triggers a range of defensive mechanisms. So, anger, spill, leaving the situation and all that. And that's basically what she says. And so for DiAngelo, white fragility is the idea that people are just very fragile in conversation about race, and that they're just not emotionally equipped to deal with it. In some sense, you would say they're not being proper Stoics, I suppose, that they're not equipped to deal with the hard controversies about race. Big problem with it, though, is that once she starts to explain their theoretical backdrop, the framework, whiteness and implicit bias and all sorts of things, if you start to just sort of moderately, coolly raise some questions, if you say, well, for instance, the implicit bias paradigm is very problematic, and there's all sorts of problems in the literature and so on. It's as if every objection, every question, every resistance is basically just cast away as white fragility. And so it becomes impossible to have any kind of dialogue. It's just a monologue. So it's a Kafka trap, where every profession of innocence, so to speak, is taken as evidence of your guilt. And that's essentially what white fragility functions as. So basically, D'Angelo has never considered the possibility that she's just a bad diversity trainer, and that when she comes in and tries to talk about this in her obstinate, very dogmatic way, it's just to be expected that people. I mean, and I granted a lot of people are probably not going to know that the literature on implicit bias, and they're not going to know the Foucault and the Derrida and all the philosophy that underlies all this stuff. But they're still raising reasonable objections. And to just cast away all objections and accept and allow just her to be the pietist arbitrator of all that can be said. That's what it really comes down to. Then there's just all sorts, the central premise of implicit bias, which has all sorts of problems. There's the reification fallacy involved in whiteness. There's all sorts of logical fallacies. There's exploiting narratives at the expense of facts, and then there's logical problems. So yeah, I mean, it goes on.
So for those of us who don't really like being called fragile, uh, um, what should we be doing at in our day-to-day lives, like at work, when they bring out the training that everybody's required to take, and if you differ from what is taught in the training, which I should say, I've been in corporate training for 7 years now, and I have never seen one of the like horror story type trainings where they're taught they're try to be less white, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I know that those things are few and far between, but on the other hand, I mean, every major corporation now has diversity training, and the implication, of course, is that we aren't diverse enough. And the reality is that we are very diverse. Every company that I've ever worked for is such a. I mean, it's well. Let's just say that it is diverse. There are lots and lots of races represented. There's lots and lots of genders represented, including transgender people. And I mean, I'm a white dude, but I'm a gay white dude, and 10 years ago, especially, being a gay white dude meant something. And I've never been discriminated against, really, at least not in a corporate environment. So I guess the question is, what should we be doing? Should we be trying to combat this? Should we just be putting our heads down and not saying anything? Does it depend? Does it depend on our constitution?
Yeah, I guess I would say I don't have any definitive advice. My approach is essentially to try to explore the intellectual foundations of it all and write about it and talk about it. If I were actually required to participate in a training, my nature of my participation would really depend, I suppose, on the situation. I guess I would probably be inclined to just remain silent, say whatever, just kind of sit through it, sleep through it, because most likely it's just gonna. I mean, I don't want to say that definitively because it might have some useful stuff here and there, but most likely it's just, given the fact that I've studied a lot of this stuff, it'll just have a lot of talking points that I've already come across. And raising questions about the theoretical underpinnings of it all will just kind of divert the trainer from doing what he or she needs to get the check for the hour-long presentation, and likely the case that a lot of people in the audience are not going to be familiar with all the controversy, the nuances of the theory, so it probably just be a waste of time. And you'll read a lot. You can read a lot of articles that come up that say that diversity trainings, they don't really work, at least as they're set up. I mean, Jan Van B, I don't remember how to say his name. He's an NYU psychologist who's done some very interesting research. I mentioned it in the book, about if you group people, different types of people in groups, that ultimately they work together as a group, and it just transcends like the sexual orientation or the race or whatever. They just see each other as members of the same group, and that tends to be very effective. but the boilerplate diversity trainings basically just don't work. I mean, at least that's my understanding. I mean, they just it's ironic because you see a lot of quote unquote anti-capitalism, and Ibram Kendi and many other, even well, Dubois is a century before us, but he was a Marxist. But you have a lot of these sort of because it's all about systems of power. So you have this sort of anti Black Lives Matter, admittedly Marxist. At least the founders admitted to be very sympathetic to Marx. So you have this, anti-capitalist streak, and yet really it just becomes an industry in itself, a profit-making industry in itself. And probably, as I said, profit is not bad, and it's actually not, as Marx said, in terms of surplus value and unpaid labor. In this case, it's paid labor. The problem to me is that the value isn't there. So it's profit, but it's just not value. But that's just the way the markets work out, and that's what economics is about. To take it back, I mean, who am I to say you shouldn't be doing this? Like, this is what people want to do, right? There's demand for it. So prices are what they are because there's demand for it and there's resources to be allocated. And I mean, that's essentially how economics works. So it's, in some sense, it's economics in action. And really, for those who find it to be so counterproductive, it's really up to them, like, to make the case for why it's counterproductive. And that's what I've been trying to do. And so again, I guess no definitive advice. In my own case, I'd probably sleep through it and just continue doing what I'm doing, which is trying to explore the theoretical foundations of it all. And I do see merit in various aspects of social justice, or the current social justice movement. Obviously, in general, social justice is a good thing. It's a matter of what it amounts to. And I guess the final point is that Counterweight, which was founded by Helen Pluckrose, and which I write for. I'm about to write some regular articles for them, but they're probably the place to go to get advice on how to deal with this stuff, because that's what they specialize. It was founded to help people navigate these issues, diversity trainings, etc. So Counterweight, or to make a pitch for them.
Cool. I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. So you mentioned social justice. It's in the subtitle of your upcoming book, Virtue in the Age of Identity Politics. Friedrich Hayek had a pretty scathing criticism of social justice as a concept, because it collectivizes justice, and justice is by definition individual, according to him. What do you think of that sort of collectivism versus individualism in specifically this topic?
Well, I should begin by saying that at least the word collectivism itself is very anathema to me personally. I very much am inclined towards an individualist approach to life, and I think that's largely a matter of personality, and then over time a matter of sort of philosophical outlook in a sense. But I do, nevertheless, I did like Ayn Rand's novels when I was a kid, and I still think they're nice. They're interesting novels, and but I don't think that I would get on board with that kind of libertarianism, just because first, I don't think Rand was I think that her understanding of economics was not as good as it could have been, being against antitrust legislation and so on. But the point is that there is a place for public goods. Markets don't work perfectly in every situation. There's a place for public goods. There's a place to take into account the social costs of externalities. And I'm talking about economics right now. In terms of social justice, I tend to be very skeptical of the idea that social constructionism is as fundamental as it is to the two questions of justice, conceived in terms of either class, as Marx would talk about it, or race, as CRT would, basically in general, like ideology or discourse, that people are sort of joined together in social groups by virtue of subscribing consciously or unconsciously to sort of ruling class ideology or discourse. I do think that there's obviously cultural similarities, like I know, growing up in sort of like the um, inner city neighborhoods of Providence, Rhode Island. On the east side of Providence, it was definitely a different kind of well-heeled culture, and people are actually nicer to me there than they were in the inner city, but whatever. Yeah, I mean, if you're asking me my preferences, I'm more inclined towards the Hayek view. Um, but I do think that there's merit. I mean, obviously, race is something that, for example, and I talk about this in chapter 10 of the White Fragility book, which is that white privilege, if you will, or whiteness as property, like something that all people that were quote unquote white partake in, for a long time was fundamental to what America was about. And there was a very, obvious, really profound difference in social product or social outcomes and resource allocation just based on this sort of, ultimately concept of race that really is made up, but nevertheless, quote unquote, reified, they say, or reinforced through social norms and discourses and ideologies and that sort of thing. And so I'm not here to say it's all bunk, because I do think there is something to be said. I think intersectionality makes sense to a certain degree. And so I think that my main problem with it is the extent to which it becomes fundamental to everything. You get sort of like a bit availability bias, confirmation bias, basically a lot of it becomes a heuristic to filter everything. All the situational intricacies of the realities around us get shoehorned into this big framework of social constructivism, and we're supposed to understand everything in terms of social constructs, when in fact every situation is really different. And I mean, I don't want to kind of ramble, but I have a lot. I wouldn't say ramble. I don't want to go on and on because there's a lot I could say about this. I am thinking of the Quillette article I wrote in September about why culture does matter for racial disparities. And the issue is not to say that, Kendi would say that to say someone is culture is how does it say? To say that there's something wrong with a culture is to say something there's inferior in culture is just wrong. That's a fallacy of false equivalence, and that you can come up with sort of cultural trends. Like, for instance, one of the things I was writing about was soul food in Black culture in the South, and how it arose and so on. And there's a discussion amongst people about how soul food can, if it, it's high fats and salts and so on, and it can contribute to bad health outcomes. And so, to the extent that that's a cultural factor that can affect, we would want to address it. Nothing about that is saying there's something inferior about the culture or Black people or whoever is engaging in that kind of. It's just saying that there's something there to address in terms of culture, and in terms of measuring culture, that gets very difficult, and get into these endogeneity issues that I talk about, so reverse causation and selection bias and unobserved heterogeneity, in other words, omitted variable bias. And so anyway, there's so much I could say about this. That's why I probably have a sort of meandering quality to what I'm saying right now. But the issue is that I don't think that it is incorrect, or I think that there is merit to thinking about things in sociological terms, in terms of social constructs. And I do think that we need to take that into account. But I'm not inclined to say that everything comes down to a social construct.
or at the very least that if it is a social construct, there are other there's other factors that determine its reality.
Yeah, I mean, when I was getting into the soul food and culture thing, I mean, there's this basic debate between whether racial inequality can be attributed to social structures or whether it can be attributed to culture. And my argument is it is both, and that there's that the interaction between the two
Mm-hmm.
can go both ways. Like, obviously, we have a legacy of slavery and racism and so on in the U.S., which is just absolutely profound and needs to be taken into account in terms of its legacy. Um, but at the same time, um, you have cultural developments that arise out of that can reinforce the racial inequality which we saw. I mean, I used the example of basketball. There was a time when baseball was the main sport for Black America, and Jackie Robinson and all that, the Negro leagues and so on. And then at some point, basketball, in say the 60s and 70s, just became, quote unquote black sport. At least 75, 80% of NBA players are black, and it's a big sport in black culture and so on. And that some people say that that's the result of the fact that we don't have proper baseball infrastructure in the inner city or whatever, and so therefore it traces back to slavery again, social construct or whatever. But the thing is, baseball was big among Black Americans in mid 20th century, and it might just be in this case that basketball just became more popular in Black culture. I mean, it's just and so that in a sense resulted in this sort of, if you want to call it, racial inequality, where you have many, many more Black players than white players. And so, these two factors are interacting with each other and reinforcing each other in different ways. And you can't discount the role of culture. None of this is saying that there's something inferior about Black culture. I mean, that's the thing that kind of gets on my nerves, is the notion that somehow this is saying something, that there's something inferior about Black culture. If, for instance, you just read some literature and say that Southern soul food is regarded as unhealthy by many people, and in fact, there's movements to try to make it healthier. I mean, that's just an example, but it's also not to discount the profound importance of social structures, whatever they may be. So anyway.
So the complete subtitle of the book, Virtue in an Age of Identity Politics, is a Stoic approach to social justice. Without, I don't want you to spoil your entire book because we want people to buy it, but what would you say is a good kind of overview of a Stoic approach to social justice?
Yeah, it's about virtue. It's about developing this. I mean, I guess this goes back to your question about Hayek, that essentially it begins with the individual. And in the book, I draw a distinction between it's drawn from Julia Annis's book, Intelligent Virtue, but the living of your life and the circumstances of your life. And that's about the dichotomy of control, that there's nothing you can do about where you were born, family that you were born into, and so on. What you need to focus is on the living of your life. And that's about character development and virtue and so on, and exercising your capacity for reason. And that is where the pursuit of justice really begins, as opposed to starting with social structures. So it's focusing on intent versus impact. And to just put it in terms of an example, I actually bring up the example of George Floyd and Darnella Frazier, the young woman who took the video of the event, and basically saying that was an example of Stoic virtue in the pursuit of racial justice, because there's this really very, very, this event going on where you get a cop who's got his knee on his neck for 9 minutes, right? And people are gathering around a stressful situation, and people are probably, are all concerned about, in those situations, you never know exactly what you're going to. But she had the presence of mind, i.e., wisdom, to keep that camera fixed on the event, and then having the courage to hand it over the authorities. And courage, I mean, I read stories about how she kind of had to leave her house for a while and stay in another place. It was not just anxiety, but I guess she was facing a lot of backlash from certain parts of the population. So, it took some courage. And of course, it was about justice, because it would lead to the conviction of Chauvin. And just having the self-control to do it all, which is self-control, temperance, moderation. So in a sense, that was Stoic virtue in action. And the idea is that each of us has the ability to contribute to justice given the situation we're faced with any particular situation we're faced with, and our ability to make choices in those situations that are either virtuous or not virtuous. And it's not just in individual situations, but you can devote yourself to lifelong quests for, whether it be criminal justice reform, figuring out how to reduce racial inequality, what have you. Is Stoic concept, oikiosis, I think it is, but the point is we all have a role to play. And so instead of getting so bent out of shape about how the system is, screwing us over, that it's, the system can't reform itself and all that jazz. The issue is to do what you can to actually try to help reform the system. Focus on that. And I think that's what Stoicism is about, is focusing on intent, moral intention, virtue, building a character. Because when you do, justice is about treating people well, treating people with dignity and respect and so on, and all else will follow.
Great. Yeah, oikiosis sounds like it has similar roots to economics, actually, being that oikonomia or whatever is the Greek root for economics. Something like that. Anyway, so I guess my final question, and this is just something that I've been really trying to reason through in my mind lately, and you might have already answered it, but do you believe that humans have a telos, like a purpose, a fundamental functionality that is ours, unique from other animals?
Well, I do tend to be, I guess you call me a Stoic. I actually would say that I like Stoic philosophy, and I think I incorporated a lot of it into my life, and I did so before I even knew it, because I had sort of had these natural Stoic inclinations. Anyway, I mentioned this because, in a sense, the Stoics come from they're the ancients, and the ancients were very much about the idea that with Aristotle and so on, there's this difference between man and animal based on rationality. And also very much about sort of the telos. And in fact, Stoicism is, in some sense, they have a very specific conception of nature, talking about nature, but it's important to actually sort of explain briefly about what we mean by nature. And it's basically the idea that we have the potential to be these sort of perfectly virtuous people. So it's about teleological conception of nature. It's about what we're capable of becoming. So I guess if you want to come back to the sort of Stoic inclinations that I have, then I would say yes. Obviously are creatures of reason. We have this potential to be virtuous creatures. And by the way, it's not about becoming more and more virtuous. For Stoics, it's either you are or are not virtuous. Most of us are not virtuous. It's about striving to be virtuous. But at any rate, in that sense, yes. But at the same time, I have to admit that, you know, from the time I was in high school, Darwin was very, very influential to me. Um, and I do think that ultimately the universe is kind of amoral. Like, I wouldn't say there's anything special about human beings.
Mm.
And so when we say as Stoics that the universe is rational, it's rational in the sense that it's intelligible to us. And as far as I understand it, there's a debate among the Stoic community about that. And I don't think my friend Guy Whiting necessarily agree with me, but the um, the issue is that I'm inclined to not believe that, which maybe you could say conflicts with that Stoic inclination to live in accordance with nature, where nature is this teleological conception of being the best we can be. Um, and I myself, I think it's perfectly reconcilable, because the idea is we are rational, we have reason. And that implies to me that we can figure out how to be virtuous. Um, but I don't think it necessarily follows, it doesn't have to follow that, um, and I don't know if this is actually what you were asking, but that the universe itself is teleological, and that therefore we have this sort of higher purpose, if you will.
Awesome. That was way deeper than I expected it to go. I liked that. Thank you so much. Um, so I guess to close it out, why don't you go ahead and plug where people can follow you if you have social media or particular websites where you write, things like that.
Yeah, I guess there's my Twitter account. It's John David Church, um, and it's JON. And then the website, I guess, is jonathandavidchurch.com, www. Um, I guess that's all. You know, I guess I somewhat sheepishly say I'm not the best self promoter, but and kind of have to get it out there, I suppose. And so that's where you would go. I just kind of like to think about this stuff, and really, that's it. I'm not trying to go out there and rant and rave about it, I guess. But I just like to think about these things because they're important things to think about. And I guess the point is, it's ultimately not about me; it's about the ideas. But you know, um, the reality is I have to get them out somewhere, and so you can find that on Twitter and my website.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. The book's Reinventing Racism: Why White Fragility is the Wrong Way to Think About Racial Inequality is available now. And the upcoming one, which I don't have written, Virtue in an Age of Identity Politics, A Stoic Approach to Social Justice, is upcoming. Do you have a publication date for that?
Yeah, right now it's supposed to be May 2022.
Cool.
May, although I will see. I mean, it could vary. Who knows? But that's the scheduled publication date.
Great. Well, I appreciate your work. Thank you for being reasonable and rational. And we will talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, James.
Recording stopped.
Oh, shoot. Did I?